Okay. So looking at this bullet point here dealing with the destruction of Black civilization, how how does Williams present his thesis in the opening chapter of Destruction of Black civilization? Think about the effects of fragmentation and isolation had on African nations, and how were forms of African communication forever changed. Think about the roles the Arabic invasion and enslavement, along with the migration of Asian and later European migrants, led to the mixing of African nations, and what were the effects of this mixing. So to start off, right, we have to deal with the thesis. So you should be able to state and articulate what the thesis of the reading is. But more importantly, as this question is framed, you have to articulate how does Williams go about producing his thesis. So when you hear the word how, you should always think about method, right? So what is the methods that are used to allow you as a reader to understand the main points or arguments from the reading? In Williams' case, right, he uses historical accounts. He's looking at history in order to lay out his argument, right? He's looking at historical phenomenons and happenings that inform the way that African people were forced to migrate, and some of the things that eroded their civilization. The other thing that he looks at is what's called topography, right? Or how you can look at the land or look at nature as a way to form your argument. So if you think about how he talks about the role of the Sahara Desert, if you think about how he talks about it being a coastal land, right? So that drove a lot of people to that area. If you think about those things, he's talking about the ways that nature had effect, right? He talks about things like the first and third cataracts. Those are markations so you could determine what part of the land that he's talking about, right? So is it the northern part of Kemet? Is it the lower part of Kemet? These are determined by what he calls the first and third cataracts. So we have history as one component of how he goes about presenting his thesis. And then the other account is topography, right? Looking at the land and looking at nature. Now, those aren't the only two, but those are just the two that I'm offering up to you for the study guide. So thinking about the effects of migration, in fact, sorry, of fragmentation and isolation. Um, so for me, when I'm thinking about this aspect of the reading, I'm thinking about how he says when the Arabic enslavement trade begins to move its way through Africa, and the African inhabitants have to flee or have to run away to avoid capture. He says that they split off into groups, right? Not all of them ran together. They split off into smaller groups and went into different directions, right? So this is part of that fragmentation that's being talked about within the question, and also the isolation that's produced by that fragmentation, right? Um, but this also leads into the second part of the question, which talks about the communication, right? And I mentioned in the lecture for this reading that Africa has over 1,200 languages, right? Part of those various languages and various dialects stem from that isolation and that fragmentation. As I mentioned, we may all start off speaking one language, but as we break up into smaller groups and we go our separate ways, we'll add our certain dialectical distinctions on the language and making it a different language. So one of the ways that African communication has been forever changed is through the development of these various languages and dialects due to the fragmentation and isolation. Um, Thinking about the roles of the Arabic invasion and enslavement, one, I've already kind of touched on that, right? The Arabic invasion forced them to migrate inward, forced them to deal with the Sahara Desert and things of that nature. Um, Along with thinking about the migration of Asian and later European migrants and this notion of being mixed or mixing, right? One of the things to keep in mind as it pertains to Asian migration into Africa, he talks about how they would marry into the royal families, and that way they would have access to the land and the resources, right? This is a very specified tactic that Asian migrants move to begin to take control over resources in Africa. Um, the Europeans also did their mixing. They just weren't as keen as the Asians were as it pertains to marrying into royal families, but they certainly did their mixing. The effects of the mixing. So when a Asian man impregnated an African woman, the offspring of that union or the offspring of that pregnancy, that child would fight for the Asian, side, right? So if it went for times of war, the child would take the side of the father or the Asian invader side. If an Arabic man had impregnated an African woman, that child would fight on the side of the Arabs. Same is true with the Europeans. If the European had impregnated an African woman, that child would fight on the side of the Europeans. So what ends up happening is these mixed armies, these mixed babies, these mixed offsprings produce an army that is volatile and violent towards their native inhabitants, right? So essentially, these babies begin to wage war on the African mothers that produce them and the societies of these African mothers that produce them. So that's one of the effects of the mixing. Um, are there any questions about anything that was mentioned or just about the destruction of Black civilization as a whole? All right. Well, I'll move on to Van Sertima's text. They came before Columbus. So again, we're dealing with this word how, right? So we should know already how to start thinking about how in terms of methodology. How does Van Sertima produce his thesis in the text that came before Columbus, the chapter Mandingo Traders in Medieval Mexico? Be prepared to engage a discourse on the two most foundational elements of cultural confluence between African and indigenous cultures. And why is Mexico such a central area of focus for Van Sertima? So again, having to know what the thesis is, but then understanding how Van Sertima produces this thesis. So just like the work of Williams, Van Sertima's text is an historical account, right? He's using history to talk about the role of African culture and indigenous culture being combined, right? But another thing that he uses is narratives, personal narratives. So think about the account that is told of the individual seeing the Africans come on to the indigenous land, him watching the Africans build their altars and what have you, and then being invited in to participate with their religious practices, right? So that is a first-hand account or a first-hand narrative of what is being observed. So for Van Sertima, he's using not only historical contextualization, but he's also using narrative accounts. Um, engaging in a discourse on the two most foundational elements of cultural confluence. So one, he deals with language, right? He talks about the kind of cultural confluence that is exhibited via language. And then he also talks about the role of the confluence of religion, right? So he talks about the religion of the coyote and the religion of the hyena and how they're similar, right? And then finally, Mexico is a central area of focus for Van Sertima because he says it is in Mexico where you see the confluence of culture, right? So anywhere where you see people come together, you'll see the confluence of blood, right? You'll see babies being made. That's not too phenomenal, right? I gave you an example in the destruction of Black civilization, how, not only Europeans, but also Asian and Arabic folks came in and had babies with these Africans, right? But what you do not see there is the culture being combined. So why Mexico is important for Van Sertima, not only do you see the combination or the confluence of blood, but you see more importantly the confluence of culture. Culture is being able to be fused together. Are there any questions about Van Sertima or the or anything mentioned as it pertains to this reading? All right. So we won't be dealing with Ida B. Wells. We didn't read that. We read Harriet Tubman instead of that. So don't worry about this last bullet point. But this will be the last reading that we'll cover for our midterm. That's Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks, the chapter of our spiritual strivings. So what is the thesis of The Souls of Black Folks? I'm just asking you at this point to clearly state what the thesis is, right? And I would have to argue that this is one chapter to where there's not a lot of room for interpretation on the thesis. He stated very clearly what the thesis is. So once you state what the thesis, once you state what the thesis is, excuse me, I'm asking you to think about how Du Bois uses the veil, right? And then not only how does he use the veil, but how does the veil relate to the two worlds, right? So we know that Du Bois uses the veil as a sort of demarcator, right? As a sort of a border or a bifurcation device, right? Something that will separate two things. And that's how he's using the veil. That's how he's employing the veil. That's the work that the veil does. But how the veil relates to the two worlds is it separates the two worlds, right? So that's all I'm asking you to do is to think about the first component of the question as it relates to the second component of the question, right? So if you know how Du Bois is using the veil, if you know how the veil works, then you know that the veil works to separate the two worlds, right? So you should be able to speak to that and have a conversation around that. How would you situate double consciousness into Du Bois's thesis? So what you have to do with this is be able to think about what the thesis is, right? Have this conception of what the thesis is, but then tie that thesis to this notion of double consciousness. And we know that double consciousness is the capacity of looking at yourself through the eyes of the other who views you with contempt and pity, right? So this is what double consciousness is. But how does that relate to what the thesis is of the chapter? And then finally, what does Du Bois offer as a solution to double consciousness? So again, if double consciousness is the process of looking at yourself through the eyes of the other who views you in contempt, then what does Du Bois say we should do with this process of double consciousness? What's his solution? If I were you all, I would think about the code switching assignment, right? And what did I ask you to do as it pertains or not to do as it pertains to the code switching assignment? That'll be a great way for you to begin to think about or understand what Du Bois offers up as a solution to double consciousness. Are there any questions about Du Bois or double consciousness, the veil, anything concerning with this bullet point? Is there any questions about anything on the study guide? All right. So check it. That's all I have for you. Again, this is solely intended to make you prepared for your midterm. The greatest thing you could do for yourself is give yourself time to do the midterm. Do not wait until the last minute. That's going to make it extremely hard for you. Um, how you miss points is not answering the question entirely. How you do that is by not giving yourself time to answer the question. So again, my advice to you is take one day, answer one question. That gives you 2 days to revise and make it sound the way you want it to. I guarantee you, if you do that, you'll be fine. It's an open take-home midterm, so you could use your resources. You have a journal, you have notes from class, right? You have the readings themselves. You should use those while you're thinking about answering the questions.